Thank you very much. Yes, it was, it's always lovely speaking with different members of the OPC group. Always been a community that's been pushing towards more security in the critical infrastructure space. And I think that's well aligned with some of the Secure by Design initiatives that we have going on here at CISA, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency. We're sort of the equivalent to any of the national cybersecurity agencies you'll see in Europe, be it NCSC UK, BSI in Germany. And so we're in charge of doing risk reduction and securing a lot of both the federal government side as well as the critical infrastructure in the United States. So today what I wanted to talk about is our Secure by Design initiative, which I'll give a brief overview of, and then focus most of this talk on transitioning off of legacy systems. The fun of having a conversation with groups with like OPC are that we are doing the dual challenge of saying we're building things to be more secure, we're doing it in these industrial environments, and we have all these new solutions, but also we have all of these legacy solutions that we have to deal with and work through at the same time. And so how do we sort of walk and chew gum where we are looking to the future, but also having to keep one eye to the past, and trying to balance that from a security perspective can be quite difficult. So this talk will go over a paper and some guidance that we've put out for people who are looking to the future, and then give some methodologies that we've used to try and help uplift the past, how to uplift the legacy technologies. So if you're not familiar with the Secure by Design initiative, it came out of the US cybersecurity strategy from 2023, basically with the idea of how do we shift the burden of cybersecurity from those least capable to those most capable. That has been led by CISA since 2023, and largely that has been interpreted as moving it towards sort of to the left, to the manufacturer, because if something is designed to be secure, if it is designed with security in mind, if it is in the vendor supplier capabilities, well, then it's easier for everybody to implement. An easy example of this would be something like default passwords, which actually gets quite complicated in OT sometimes. Is it better for the manufacturer to force a change of the default password, or for the thousands or tens of thousands of units that they are selling, is it better to give the consumer the optionality to make a mistake and not change the default password over the thousands and thousands of times that they have to deploy each component? So it's a bit of a risk balancing perspective of, do we expect one group to spend a little bit more time or not? The impetus of this was because we then and still now keep seeing the number of vulnerabilities go up every year. We keep seeing the same vulnerabilities, buffer overflows, memory exploits, unsafe memory code, SQL injections, and the like. We basically see these same types of vulnerabilities year and year and year, which means that the security costs are going up and up and up. And this is sort of an unsustainable ecosystem to exist in, because it's just not actually sustainable for most organizations to keep on top of cybersecurity. And so we wanted to have an initiative to focus and try to lower the barrier to entry for doing some of the cybersecurity and give the advantage back to the defender in this very aggressive cybersecurity ecosystem we find ourselves in. So along that end, we put out this paper that is focused not just at Secure by Design, but on Secure by Design for operational technology in particular. And how we did that is we took this core Secure by Design white paper and the work that was co-sealed by 17 different international governments, and we focused it down through the legacy and operational challenges we have when securing operational technology, and then prioritized it based off some threats that we're actively seeing, such as PRC actors targeting network edge devices, or just the general targeting of network edge devices, such as internet exposed PLCs being targeted by a number of hacktivist organizations recently, as well as some long-term resilience goals. OPC UA, one of the larger benefits of it is that it applies secure communication. Obviously not a common capability in a lot of OT environments. And so how do we make things like this more common and more usable into the future? Not just saying, yes, they're good to have, but how do we make it kind of the default use case or the easier to implement use case? So that end, we implemented this paper. So Secure by Demand, priority considerations for operational technology owners and operators when selecting digital products. It's a long name, and that's how you know there were a lot of countries involved. I want to highlight here in particular, OPC has a rather large market share in Europe. We got co-sealing from DG Connect, from the European Commission in this case, as well as the Germans and the Dutch, to try and highlight that we share a shared product market and an ecosystem when it comes to a lot of this operational technology that we use in our critical manufacturing across our critical infrastructure. And so making sure that we align on the kind of security we are telling people to ask for is very important. And we were able to reach alignment with many countries in this document to show, if you're an asset owner, if you're an operator, or just a manufacturer trying to read this to see what people are going to ask for, that this is a core set of guidance that applies with your local regulatory framework, be it the CRA, be it the upcoming Cyber and Resilience Act in the UK, or be it local regulation in the United States, but also applies to sort of our ethos of where we would like security to head. So in terms of what is actually in this document, there's 12 different controls that we highlight. Now, I, of course, do not have nearly that much time to present in order to go through every single one of these controls. To highlight some quickly, things like logging the baseline product, having evidence of intrusion so that if there is an incident and somebody does manage to pivot their way into an operational technology environment, making sure that that data is available and that security logging is something that is enabled by default. Currently, a lot of products support engineering and safety logging, which can be adjacent to security logging, but it's not necessarily on by default. There's some people are charging extra for it. So we're asking manufacturers to please not charge extra for some of these logging devices, or with things like secure by default. We see time and time again that there are security capabilities like default passwords that are there but not really implemented, or they're not really required to be changed. So we're pushing people to enable the security capabilities that they can. And then as their threat model says, you must configure something like secure communications, use a protocol like OPC UA, guide the user into configuring the secure protocol and make it easier to use to fit within existing workflows. And what this talk is really going to highlight is going to focus on this idea of moving from these sort of high-level 12 controls, but we specifically want to focus on this idea of leaping to a secure foundation. So if you have an existing legacy set of infrastructure, you're actively in the process of upgrading pieces of it, but you always have this mesh of old and new in your system, what can you focus on in order to make it easier for you to not get financially locked in to a security ecosystem that is going to be costly? And so where I want to focus with this is three elements. One is secure controls. The idea of secure controls is that you are basically assuming that a threat actor is going to be targeting those components. You are threat modeling around the idea that, yes, this is a digitally connected system. I know as a component, I kind of know roughly what sort of system I'm going to be integrated into. And so I can add security into that and make some good faith security assumptions. Secure communications, sort of obvious perhaps in this group, but how can we not just focus on secure communications as a technical idea, but more so on the usability constraint, because the technology has existed for a number of years, be it OPC UA, be it Modbus over TLS, be it DNP SAV2, SAV5, be it SIP Secure. There's a number of different secure communications platforms and operational technology, and the uptake has been varied, shall we say, for them. OPC UA maybe being one of the more popular ones, particularly in critical manufacturing. And so how can we focus on the idea of human-centered design, on usability, in order to improve these and make it easier for people to adopt secure communications? And then finally, I want to talk about strong authentication, with the idea of things like multi-factor authentication and kind of meeting the threats where they're at without saying we need MFA on every sensor. So I want to go through these with kind of three different methodologies to provide you with different approaches for how you can consider security controls in the context of your legacy environment. So with secure controls, we're going to walk through this idea of how can we take our existing system and have the components be more resilient without having to upgrade our entire system. So I'll give an example of an old legacy protocol, highlight where there's an area of centralized trust to show that we can upgrade one component instead of trying to rip and replace and add crypto modules to everything. That can give us some more time with our legacy infrastructure, give us more confidence that our legacy infrastructure can be secured without having to spend all of our financial burden immediately. Secure communications, I want to focus on that usability, give some examples of human-centered design and how those principles of human-centered design and product research can be applied in the security space. And then with strong authentication, the idea is going to be, how do we not let the perfect be the enemy of good? Meaning that with a lot of the strong authentication use cases, the idea of MFA in a critical infrastructure environment, we often think of like, well, from like an operational perspective, this is going to work. Like, what is somebody on a factory floor going to pull out their cell phone and type in a code? Maybe not, but there are particular use cases where, given the threats, we might want to consider it in targeted applications. So I'm going to give an example of some of the threats and how we can apply it in particular use cases. So with that, let's jump into it. All with the ethos of, let's focus on the sticky problems, because we don't want to financially lock ourselves into a legacy foundation or a particular set of vendors or controls that doesn't allow us to be secure going forward. And the reason I focus on this so much is this idea of interconnectivity and the growing interconnectivity. And this is often thought of as sort of IT-OT convergence. I don't know that it necessarily is IT-OT convergence so much as just OT external convergence. And the idea that there's growing pressure from a lot of industries to start connecting things out to the cloud, start connecting them out to vendor networks, start connecting them out to business and enterprise networks in the name of efficiency. And this isn't some kind of future threat. This is something that we're seeing actively today. I'm sure that many of the folks in the call have seen different applications from different suppliers in this space. But to give a very real example, my background, as will become very clear by the examples that are in this presentation, is focused on transportation security. So I used to build intrusion detection systems for planes and trains to try and add security after the fact. And so a lot of my focus is on these like old serial data bus networks. And there's an interesting example here of the CAN bus developed by Bosch in the 1980s. It had no security, no authentication. Of course it didn't. It was developed in the 1980s. You can compare it to like a Modbus or a DNP3. But we get some interesting use cases here because we start adding industrial standards on top. So now there's a unified data format for these automobiles. And the reason why we invented that format is some emissions regulation to reduce emissions from vehicles, but also because for like heavy duty machinery, you really want it so that if you attach a trailer to a truck, that if you hit the brakes, the brake light will turn on regardless of the make and model of the trailer, right? Like it's all just very practical, open standard sort of ideas. And the ramification of that was, well, from an adversary perspective, now instead of having a sort of security by obscurity model where everybody was using their own proprietary version of CAN, now there's an open standard. And so the hacker just needs to basically pull up a spreadsheet where they can go through, and now you can hack all of these vehicles. Again, not a bad idea. And it's really just a case where the legacy foundation is coming to haunt some of these industrial standard ideas. And then we go forward, and in mid 2010s, late 2010s, it became very common for this idea of an electronic data logger to exist in heavy duty trucking in particular. This idea of, we're going to add a component to our vehicles, it's going to monitor the vehicle and then send all of that data back to a central repository so that we can monitor trucks or fleets of trucks. And this created a pretty clear business driver for safety purposes. Like, we're going to do fleet management and we're going to be able to track all of our fleets. And we can get a lot of bonuses out of that and get safety for the trucker by making sure they're not driving for too long or something along those ideas. All good ideas in principle. And then we can kind of see the consequences of this in reality with a vulnerability that came out in 2023, where a fleet management gateway had a CVE that allowed basically an insecure MQTT server exposed to the internet. They didn't enable TLS. It's a little difficult to configure, I suppose. Where all of these fleet management systems were connected directly to the CAN bus from the 1980s using SAE J1939. And so now all an attacker had to do was send unauthenticated messages directly to the CAN bus over this vulnerable MQTT server. And suddenly, I think they had 4,000 trucks enabled to the system. You could send arbitrary commands to, say, hit the brakes or turn the steering wheel on these 4,000 trucks. Now, obviously, this is a bad case, and thankfully, security researchers caught this before anybody nefarious did. But this is just to say, worrying about these sorts of use cases only really occurs when we have these shaky foundations. When we're building on top of these legacy protocols, it's easy for issues like this to slip through the cracks. if we can focus on moving away from those legacy protocols or away from some of those shakier foundations, it becomes much easier to have robust security conversations rather than kind of always being worried about somebody reaching down low enough in the OT network and suddenly everything is trusting and everything is open, right? We are always kind of caught on this guard of we need to segment everything off because this area at the bottom is like a bubble. And once we pop that bubble, everything is really insecure and everything is trusting. And moving away from that environment is really difficult, and why I think we need to focus on this conversation now so we don't just keep adding, and ending up in more situations like this vulnerability. So my first example is going to be from aircraft, an avionics example. So there's a protocol called MIL standard 1553. It's used in aircraft around the world. It's used in nuclear system, power systems. It's also used in some mass transit systems in the United States. There's no authentication. It's similar to Modbus in that regard. And importantly, there's a safety message that is included in the standard. And basically, when they designed the standard, they were concerned that it's an aircraft. If a component fails in the middle of flying, you need a redundant system to take over. And so as part of that, if that component fails, well, what we'll end up doing is we'll have a centralized bus controller send a message that turns off that chatty or that broken component, so it's no longer spamming the bus. And then we'll take that singular component, turn it off, and then the redundant component will take over. From a security perspective, the issue is that there's no way to authenticate whether or not that shutdown message is real and whether it was based off an error message. And so as a defender, you have to start thinking to yourself, well, if an attacker gets access to this network, suddenly they can disable computers, do denial of service at the very minimum. In this case, it was a military aircraft. You could also fire weapon systems. It got very bad very quickly. And so as a defender, what are you actually meant to do with this legacy infrastructure? Now, the sort of generic security solution would be you can start using AI, ML buzzwords here. You can monitor for anomalous timings. You can monitor for normal data in the wrong context. You can monitor for data that just doesn't make sense given what you know about the system from like an emulation or simulation perspective. But a lot of these assumptions of like this sort of generic passive monitoring solution are based on the idea that we can't really modify any of the existing components. We don't want to add more friction to the environment. But the reverse of that is that this security monitoring system is, of course, quite costly to do. It's likely to generate false positives, regardless of whether you build it yourself or not. And that requires a whole security apparatus for you to use, one which is going to be quite difficult to scale across a fleet of systems, much less any individual site or system. So what if we take a sort of secure by design targeted approach to this? Well, if we look again at the system architecture, what we'll quickly realize is, well, there's a bus controller, similar to sort of the Modbus client, Modbus server relationship, where every device does not speak unless they are spoken to by the bus controller. Now, the flaw in design for these systems is that the bus controller wasn't actually programmed to notify anybody if somebody spoofed it. So if somebody pretended to be the bus controller, it just said, oh, I must have forgotten that I sent a message. My bad. Sorry, I'll do whatever you say. And so, really the security fix here, rather than this whole continuous monitoring solution, is on the little 1553 transceiver for any component that's a bus controller. Well, if the standard says there's only meant to be one, then all we need is an if statement in the transceiver. This is, of course, slightly simplified, that says if you sent a command and it was a bus controller, but I'm the bus controller, well, that can't possibly be correct. There must be something wrong with the system. So now we've, as a defender, you've given some options here. You can spend a few million on plus labor on something that will produce a lot of false positives in the system and require many skilled analysts to actually parse and look through. Or some central components could have been designed around a malicious actor. Or like a third alternative would be you rip all of these systems out and replace them with a crypto module so that all of the communication is authenticated. The degree of cost between these solutions varies significantly. And of course, trying to actually update the firmware on any individual transceiver might be difficult. But these are conversations that are worth having, not just during procurement, but also with some of your existing solutions to see if you can buy yourself time to really architect a well-designed secure solution as you move away from legacy, but while still giving yourself some confidence that your existing solutions are not just fully trusting, not just able to be pushed over, you can add some security there on top of segmentation. So you have a little bit of defense in depth in those networks. The next thing I want to focus on is this idea of applying human-centered design to communications. So, one of the main things that we've seen with secure communications is, yes, people are conceptually interested in the idea, but having to manage a PKI, certificate infrastructure, or even set up these systems as a lot of usability concerns. People are scared of breaking the availability in their environment, breaking something in the process because of all of these legacy dependencies in the environment. And one of the challenges that we've noted time and time again when we've communicated with different suppliers is that very frequently the security teams at these organizations, usually not by choice, are entirely disconnected from the product teams in the sense of there's somebody doing product research, understanding the engineering and operational workflows. How does somebody work with their product? Is it usable as a system? But security is often tacked on as an afterthought rather than being part of the design and considering, hey, security adds friction to the environment. Is that friction acceptable for the operator? Or a better question to ask is, does that initial statement, that security adds friction, does that have to be true? So what I would consider people, ask people to consider is this idea of creating a well-lit path. That is the idea of, if you want people to do secure communications, the challenge has always been, how do you make secure communications the easy thing to do in the product, as opposed to using a insecure legacy protocol? Now that's very challenging because secure communications requires you to do a lot of system setup across your overall architecture, not even just with that singular component. But we've seen positive use cases of this in other fields, be it Google mandating MFA across all of their ecosystems whenever you log in, and making it quite difficult to do the opposite. And all of this really requires is a great deal of product research. We're actively doing this, including with some members of the OPC Foundation, to actually try and improve the adoption of secure communication by understanding, where are operators falling short and where are they having difficulties in deploying the solutions, so that it can actually be easier to implement at the asset owner side after some tweaks from the manufacturer or some tweaks at the higher protocol level. Another interesting idea here is this idea of alerting on bad configurations. There's a kind of a funny concept that we can bring over from automobiles, which is the idea of seatbelt chimes. You don't plug in your seatbelts, obviously that's bad, but from the kind of supplier perspective, their legal requirement was to give you a seatbelt to use, and then as a operator of the vehicle, you are legally required to plug in that seatbelt. The question is if the manufacturer of that automobile knows that the safe thing to do is to use the seatbelt, is there any way that they can remind the user to go down the sort of safe path, the well-lit path? In automobiles, we've seen this as sort of a seatbelt chime. It's an interesting idea in operational environments to say, how can we apply the idea of a seatbelt chime, notably noting that a lot of extraneous noise in an operational environment is a bad idea, but how can we notify users of things that we know are bad behavior? A good example of this is internet exposed components, or exposed to the public internet rather. So, we're seeing a lot of cases where hacktivists, particularly from Russia, are actively targeting internet exposed PLCs. They're just out there on Shodan, exposing whatever legacy protocol, and you can just log into, or an HMI, you can just kind of log into the HMI, it has a default password, and it's really quite simple for some of these adversaries to do. And you talk to some of the suppliers in this case, or you talk to anybody who's managed this equipment before, and they'll say, well, that component was never meant to be connected to the open internet, but clearly we have a training or a knowledge gap, or simply an implementation mistake that led to those devices being connected to the public internet without any sort of security gateway or anything in front of them. And so as the supplier, how can we think about this issue from the perspective of, I know that that is never meant to happen. Is there a way for me to notify the user, either via logs, via a chime, via some sort of mechanism, that this is really not how the product was intended to be used? And they can accept that risk if they wish, but that's the general case of how can we apply human-centered design to steer people towards the path that is safe, that is secure, but is also fundamentally usable for them. in their environment. Now, finally, I'm going to talk about this idea of strong authentication. That is the idea of applying something like multi-factor authentication into operational technology environments. Now, like I said earlier, the idea of you taking like an RFID card and tapping it on the side of a PLC to do change management might sound a little silly, but what we're seeing from threat actors right now is like one of the common attack paths is really just you attack a network edge device, you dump credentials from that network edge device, you pivot into the network to try and pop some sort of domain controller, get AD, and then from there, you use the fact that there are either shared credentials in the OT environment or common credentials or bad default passwords to then be able to pivot into that environment and potentially do something in the future. And of course, the challenge with all of this credential dumping from the OT perspective is that, well, we don't really change passwords very much in these environments. Usually it's seen as an operational risk. It's just not in the day-to-day workflows. And so if you're relying purely on segmentation as a control, well, now you have two things to worry about. One is that threat actors are targeting network edge devices, the firewalls, the security gateways that are usually the things enforcing that segmentation. And two, you have this idea of, we see a lot of incidents in the field where people have applied segmentation to various degrees of success. From the cybersecurity agency perspective, segmentation is always going to be one of those security controls we recommend. Obviously, you should try and segment your IT and OT networks, or even functionally within your OT network, micro-segmentation there as well. The challenge is like it's quite a difficult technical control to do correctly. And so it raises the thought of, yes, MFA on every piece of the environment is maybe a bad idea. It's kind of normalized to do from a bastion host perspective, this idea of a jump box where getting into the OT environment, you need some sort of MFA if you're coming from an external network. But then there's sort of this crown jewels question of, as an operator, you understand what is a bad day for you. If this system got changed, if the GDS were compromised, or if some key controller were compromised and changed maliciously, that would be incredibly bad. You would not be able to replace that component, or it would cause some sort of safety impact or engineering failure that is unacceptable to you. Then perhaps we do want something like a multi-factor authentication there, simply for change management, making sure that some level of change is unacceptable by adding an additional security control for peace of mind. So that even if segmentation is bypassed, you know that they need additional layers of vulnerabilities, additional layers of compromise to be able to actually take over any of these systems, take over any of these crown jewels. And that's why, as part of the secure by design effort, that we're trying to make some of these capabilities more ubiquitous. Because if it is on the operator at the end of the day, that when they are designing their architecture, when they're designing their systems, if they have to think to themselves, well, I need one component or one controller that requires MFA on it, and I will pay however many dollars extra to have MFA as a software on one component, well, that results in a rather fragile ecosystem where you have to be correct right at the beginning of the design process. And from a security perspective, you can no longer be agile and plan around and change your ecosystem. And this results in a case where we can actively disincentivize people to do cybersecurity. And so a lot of the focus of the Secure by Demand paper and a lot of the Secure by Design initiative for OT is we currently have a lot of the security capabilities in higher end products, be it 6443, security level 3, security level 4. And the challenge has been, how can we get operators to ask for the same or similar security capabilities such that the manufacturers, the suppliers can start making these security controls and the security capabilities a bit more ubiquitous? Because if the only way you're able to buy a controller that does secure communications and all of the very good security capabilities that you want is by buying an extra expensive security level 4 capability, we're simply going to price many people out of the market. But our hope is that by making the call for these security features a bit more ubiquitous during the procurement cycle, we can result in sort of shared software libraries, shared code across these product ecosystems, such that these capabilities that are really living in software and are not dependent on a lot of these hardware capabilities, beyond things that are more standard in new components like a TPM nowadays, you can actually make these security features a bit more ubiquitous so that security is no longer the thing that you're paying a premium for. Now, of course, that will take quite a bit of time to be successful, but that's why we're encouraging people to look at our guidance, Secure by Demand for Operational Technology at CISA.gov/secure by design, to try and get people to ask for some more components and move the needle on the security ecosystem. So in conclusion, what I want to stress here is, focus on what helps you leap from that legacy foundation so that your security controls, be it identity and access management, be it logging, be it some of these secure communications foundations that we take for granted from like an enterprise security perspective. Those are the things that are really going to be costly and are going to be difficult to fix after the fact. So if you can get them right from the offset, that's a good thing to invest in the near term, or as you're thinking about procuring or replacing certain systems. Focus on human-centered design, focus on this idea of usability in your environments. If you're an asset owner, start asking questions about how has that system been designed for my use case and my workflow? Does it make sense within my environment? Seeing if that can be either tailored to you, or if there was any understanding of the friction of the security ecosystem when they were designing the security. And then finally, think about strategic areas of improvement in the meantime. If a threat actor is targeting a particular thing, such as using shared and default credentials, think about areas where you can use security controls, not ubiquitously, not across every component, but in a targeted nature. Even if that's just adding a security gateway that does MFA in front of a handful of components, that might be the thing that you need to protect some of your crown jewels, some of your key systems, and be more resilient while you're thinking about transitioning off of your legacy systems in the long term. And then, of course, like if you are a manufacturer listening to this presentation and going, well, yes, of course, that sounds easy, Matthew. Of course, I'll just add security capabilities to my product and it will be cheap. Of course, that's certainly not something I've ever asked for before. Really what we're trying to drive for with a lot of this guidance is there aren't as many market incentives for doing cybersecurity. I can argue that that's incorrect given the cost of ransomware or any other number of things. But the reality is that as a manufacturer or a supplier, you need to make the business case for why you're spending money on the cybersecurity budget and not on some new functionality within the product. Our hope is that you can take these papers, like the Secure by Design paper, and use them as that market incentive to try and help move the needle. And as we try and generate more of a demand signal from the operator base, so that we can all work together to try and get what we as a security community want, which is more resilient, more secure components in these systems. So with that, that is the rest of my presentation. If you have any questions, I think we have maybe some time for that. And of course, always feel free to reach out at Matthew.Rogers at my email there, or you can find more information on Secure by Design at that link there. And thank you very much.